Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to a new beginning, Be'ezrat Hashem. It's very out of sync for me to be here on a Monday. For the last 7 years or so, I've been here on a Wednesday. And this is the beginning of a new launch of different programming by the OU. It should be Be'ezrat Hashem very matzliach. I was very paranoid about not coming in this morning because it's not Wednesday. I put notes all around my house saying, don't forget to go to the OU because it's not Wednesday, it's Monday. And they worked, which is great. I also just got back from America last Friday, so I'm not sure exactly which time zone I'm in. But at least I'm with you, which is the main thing. If I could just mention some housekeeping rules. We have a minhag in the shir. We've been doing it for 7 years, which is every Wednesday. Now Monday I say, could everybody please turn off their phones? And every week everybody does, apart from one person whose phone rings, and it's always a different person. So if you might be that person, then please also turn off your phones. Which is, I think, will save us from musical interruptions. Now, this is a topic that a few of you requested. Simon requested it, others requested it. I must tell you I was putting off doing this topic because I was hoping that it wouldn't be relevant. But it is still relevant, and it is a fascinating topic. It will take us 3 shiurim to look at it properly. So I would ask you to just keep pace with what we're doing. You may have questions which are burning questions, but they may be questions that I will deal with next week. I will give you a brief overview of how I want to look at the topic. It's a very sensitive topic. I was a little nervous whether to deal with it at all. But I think that there are at least three good reasons for talking about this issue. The first, and perhaps most important of all, is so that we keep the connection in our minds with the hostages live and fresh, that we shouldn't for a minute stop davening, that they should be released Be'ezrat Hashem very soon and in good health, that we should do everything we can to promote the best solution that there can be, whatever that is. Therefore, I think that we should preface everything we're saying with that our tefillahs are enormously powerful, and we talked about that during the Chizuk Shirim. And therefore, that's one reason that I want to do that, and it should be a to'eles for that. The second reason is Talmud Torah is an enormous schus for the Jewish people. And Talmud Torah of something which is relevant at the time is even more interesting and even more pressing and even more engaging. Inyana D'Yoma, even though it's a very sad thing, we have to talk about it. But nevertheless, please God, the schus of our Talmud Torah should be a schut for the hostages and for the success of all the soldiers. And that is certainly nothing to be underestimated. And the third thing really is that I think that there are going to be some fascinating issues which we maybe haven't thought of before on this particular topic. It will take us round all sorts of different areas of halacha. I can tell you now we are not going to reach a clear conclusion, in case you thought that we were. None of the people, well, I can't speak for you. Baruch Hashem, I'm not responsible for making any of the unbelievably difficult decisions that need to be made. I think we should not forget to daven very hard for the people in government and the generals of the army, who are the people who have the unthinkable and unspeakable decisions to make. So they need our schus as well. I'm not speaking for you. Maybe there's someone in this room who has a secret connection with someone, and if so, then that's great. But I think it's important for us as well. We learn values from HALACHA. At least Rav Soloveitchik's approach, and that of many others, is that HALACHA is the bedrock of Jewish values. And therefore, we ourselves are discussing this issue with our families around our Shabbos tables, maybe even putting pressure on lawmakers and people in government to reach certain conclusions. It's good for us to see the different factors. Even if we won't come to a clear conclusion, it's good for us to weigh the halachic factors, and therefore I think we're going to learn a lot from this topic. Okay, so let's get into it. We've got a lot to do, and as I say, this is part 1 of Be'ezrat Hashem, 3 parts. For the first 35 years or so of the Israeli government, since 1948, their official policy was we do not negotiate at all with terrorists. And that is, in theory, the policy of the American government, the most Western governments, and there are reasons for that which we'll maybe discuss next week. However, that began to change. The first major challenge to that policy was actually the Entebbe kidnapping, which we're not going to talk about this week, even though our source sheet's going to take us through. Tragically, kidnapping Jewish people is not a new event. It's something which reverberates through our entire history, from Tanakh, through the Gemara, through the Middle Ages, through the modern period. Rabbi Wein, he should live and be well, says there are two themes for Jewish history. The first theme is that Jewish history repeats itself. And the second constant theme is that in every generation people say, well, yes, that was true until now, but it won't happen again this time. They are the two constant themes. So our sources are replete with examples of kidnapping issues, which we'll talk about as well. But the Israeli government's policy until Entebbe was that we will not negotiate with terrorists. Next week, we will look in detail at the rabbinic committee stroke conclave, whatever we want to call them. Conclave sounds it's touched on the Catholic side, but a group of very eminent rabbis that were gathered together by Yitzhak Rabin in 1976 to discuss whether they should indeed be negotiating with the terrorists. Now, you and I know the ending of that episode, which was a very positive ending, although there was loss of life, of course. But we'll deal with that next week. So Entebbe didn't become a really crucial issue because in the end they rescued the hostages. But already in the 1980s, in 82, 83, and I brought you a few examples here at the beginning in English, there were, unfortunately, in the First Lebanon War, there were hostages which were captured. And in 1985, under the Gibraltar Agreement, there was an agreement that the Israeli government released 1,150 prisoners. This was in 85. In exchange for the 3 Israeli captives captured during the First Lebanon War. Now, many of those people who were released went on to be ringleaders in the First Intifada. Rav Goren at the time, maybe we'll have a chance to look at his letter, was very against this deal and said that it would lead to future consequences which were very undesirable. Rab Chaim David Halevi, the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv at the time, was in favor of this deal halachically. We'll get a chance to look at a little bit of those arguments, not today. And then Rav Goren kind of changed his mind a little bit and said, well, yes, that's interesting. When you look at it in that perspective, maybe there is more to say. But that was perhaps one of the first major episodes. In October 2000, the Hezbollah captured IDF soldiers in the Lebanon area, and there was a prisoner swap again in 2004. They handed over militants, they handed over information. There was the whole Elchanan Tannenbaum affair, which raises questions we will deal with today, which they found out that Tannenbaum actually had been kidnapped as part of a trip that he made to do an illegal drug deal. So the question is, do we redeem captives when, to some degree, they've got themselves into the problem of captivity? Obviously, that's not the case that we're dealing with today, but that's an interesting question as well. A little bit later still, the Second Lebanon War, as you will probably remember, the Second Lebanon War was triggered by the capture of 2 IDF soldiers that I've mentioned here in little number 3. And there was, again, a deal to release a number of terrorists in exchange for even the bodies being returned to Israel. The most recent that I put in little number 4 here was, of course, the IDF soldier Gilad Shalit. I feel a little bit bad for him and his family in everything that's going on at the moment. I don't know how they're dealing with this. Whether or not we agree or don't agree with what was done then, it's certainly not his responsibility, and it's certainly not his family's responsibility. But as we will remember, over 1,000 Palestinian and Israeli Arab terrorists and prisoners were released in order to get Gilad Shalit back. And as we know, to our great sadness, many of these people are the ringleaders of what's happening right now. Okay, exactly. And therefore, where does that leave us? Well, I'm sure we have lots of opinions, and we have lots of strong-held views. But let's look at some of the sources that deal with the different ideas behind whether we do and how we do deal with these situations. So let's start with Tanakh. It's important to start with Tanakh. Ultimately, that's where everything starts. And there are a number of key hostage situations in Tanakh. Let's start with the first one. Avram Avinu. Lot was captured. And number 1, Vayishma Avram ki nishba achiv. V'yerek et chanichav, he decided on a military solution. Even though he was fighting against the four kings, who were the superpowers of the Middle East, he aroused all of his students, he got them up, he mobilized them, I think you'd say, Yelidei Beito, Shmona Asav Shloshemeos, 318 of them, V'yirdav Adan, and they chased the army, V'chalik Aleihim Laila, and he fell on the army in the night, V'huva Avadav V'yakem V'yirdafeim V'adchova, and he beat them and he chased them away. Small Damascus all the way up to Damascus. V'yashev et kol ha'archush, he took all of the spoils of the war. That's a different question. Maybe in the third shir we'll talk about what are the rules in halacha of war. Are there halachot of war? What is acceptable? Do the ends justify the means? That's a very important question. Is our focus on what we're trying to achieve? It doesn't matter how we do it. Or are there rules, that are there limits? But we'll talk about that not today. I keep telling you what we're not going to do today, but we will do lots today, okay? And he chased him all the way to Damascus. They took his rechush. V'gam et Lot achiv, he rescued Lot as well, and he got him back. So there is a military rescue organized by the first Jew, or at least the first proto-Jew. Avram Avinu was as Jewish as anyone had been up till then. And it was a military rescue for one, or maybe his family as well, I suppose, was there, for one family. We see in number 2, perhaps a lesser-known episode. That's number 3. Number 2, first we'll get to Yaakov and his sons with Shechem, and this has lots of very powerful resonances. This is a very well-known episode, number 2. Vayom Yaakov el Shimon ve'el Levi. If you remember the story, you know the story well. Dinah was kidnapped, and she was raped and abused. And then they tried to do some kind of deal with the Jewish people to give her back or to keep her or to marry her. And of course, Shimon and Levi secretly launched a military campaign and slaughtered the people of Shechem and got their sister back. So Yaakov was very critical. What will the non-Jews say? How can we do this? Look at the public opinion. It's very interesting. Yaakov is already telling us that this was a concern. We're a small nation in a big world. We cannot afford to just do whatever we want. Maybe, Putin is the president of one of the biggest countries in the world, can just do whatever he likes, and ultimately nobody can do anything about it. We're not those people, says Yaakov. We have to think about the longer term geopolitical consequences. Baknani, Ubaprizi, Va'animate Mispar, I'm living as a small number amongst all of these nations. The Nesfualai, they're going to come at me. They're going to take me to the European Court, the Human Rights Court. They're going to do things, Vikune, and they're going to destroy me. And everything that I've built so far will be destroyed. How can you do that? To which, of course, the sons answer, well, what do you want us to do? And Rashi says, Hakazoni means hefka. Well, Jewish blood should be hefka? Jews should be able to be kidnapped and abused and raped and we don't do anything about it? How can that be? That can't be. There has to be a response. And Yaakov, we don't see who won that answer, that conversation. And if you look in the Meforshim, different people say different things. The Rambam says that they were justified in doing what they did. The Ramban says it's not so clear. Yaakov criticizes them. And again, in Parshas Vayechi that we read just a couple of weeks ago, he curses them basically for what they did. So who was right? Should they have done it? Shouldn't they have done it? See, you see here the most fascinating presentation in the earliest times of the Jewish people, that it's not clear what you do. Can you just react? Or how can you not react? Which is, I think, really fascinating. Number 3 is a lesser-known source in Bamidbar, which I'm not going to go to in detail. Vayishma Kanani Melech Arad, Yoshev HaNegev, the Jewish people were in the Negev, and the king of Arad heard Kiba Yisrael Derech Hatarim, that the Jews were coming. V'yelachem Yisrael v'yesh mimenu shevi, and he attacked them and he took a shevi, a captive, a hostage. Rashi says, Eina ela shifcha achat, just one young woman who was a shifcha. She was a lowly servant, slave woman that they had, and that's the only person they took. Nevertheless, the Jewish people said, you don't take Jews. There are consequences. One person, doesn't matter. One person is one person. V'yido Yisrael nedel Hashem, and the Jewish people together made a vow. V'yome imnatzon titen et ha'am hazeh biyadi, if we win against these people, v'charam te'et areihem, we will destroy their cities, or we'll make them chayra, and we'll give them to the mikdash, whatever that means at the time. V'yishma Hashem b'kol Yisrael, God listened. V'yitzim et knani v'charem atem v'et areihem v'yikra Hashem ha'makom charma. So again, the Jewish people launched launched a military strike against hostage takers for one person, and an unimportant quotes and quotes person. There's no unimportant people in the Jewish people, even a shivcha who was taken captive. And number 4, which I won't go through in detail because we don't have enough time, but it's a famous episode at the end of Shmuel Aleph where David and his men are busy attacking the Plishtim and the Amalekim, and the Amalekim launch a raid on Siklag, where the women and the children were waiting for the Jewish soldiers to come back. Maybe we'll just read a few psukim. When David and his army came back to Siklag, source number 4, Bayom HaShlishi, on the 3rd day, Amaleki pashtu et Negev. The Amaleki had gone across the Negev, Va'al Siklag, they came to Siklag, V'yaku et Siklag, and they destroyed Siklag. V'yisrifu ot ha'ba'esh, and they burnt it all down. V'yishbu et hanashim asheba, and they'd taken ransom, captive, the women. And this is called classic Amalek, which is what we see in our own days. We find Amalek takes the defenseless, the children, the women, the people who are not able to fight back. Mikatana Gadol, the lowly women, if you like, of the society, and the great women, we'll see who they were. Loimitu. They didn't kill anybody. V'in hagu, they just took them away. V'yelchu l'darkam, and they'd taken them to their place where they were. V'yova David v'anashav el ha'ir, and this is actually fascinating. David and his men came back. V'hine srufa ba'esh, they see this sight of immense destruction. V'neshemu b'neihem v'natehem nishbu, and their women, their wives, and their children had been taken hostage. What was the first reaction? V'yisa David v'ha'am asher ito et kolam v'yivku, shock and mourning. And we all remember this like disbelief. How could this have happened? They cried until they couldn't cry anymore. They were so distressed by what had happened. They even took away David's queens. Well, he wasn't yet the king, but Shaul was still the king. David's wives. David was incredibly personally destroyed by this, and the people wanted to stone David. Because, of course, the first reaction is, how could our leaders allow this to happen? How could you let this happen? David, you're Mr. Security. On you, that's your thing. And yet you've let us down. So again, we see nothing is new. Ein chadash. And David, in the end, he consults the Urim and the Tumim, and they said, you have to go and you'll rescue them, and they managed to get them back. That was a successful raid back to bring the hostages back. But again, it's just so evocative. The Tanakh, we're living through Tanakh. I really feel that. Many people feel that. Another time I'll tell you, I've just spent a few weeks in America. I don't have time to talk about it now. But one of the Rabbonim in America, next week maybe, okay. I won't have time next week either. One of the Rabbonim in America, I've heard so many anecdotal stories of different people being so affected, distant people from the Jewish communities in so many ways, which I don't have time to talk about now, but there we are, that was the one. Okay, now we're Yotze. Don't worry about it, it's fine. Someone will help you kind of turn it off, we'll be all right. One of the Rabbonim there said to me, the Jewish people in Israel are having a 1973 moment of the Yom Kippur War, which I must confess I was too young to remember the Yom Kippur War, sorry. But he said the Jews of America are having a 1967 moment. Not that they're happy, but that they're suddenly stirred up. There's a wave of recognition that they are part of the Jewish people, and that is actually fascinating what's going on right now, and we need to try and work on how to actually connect with those people. That's a different story. Hostage taking, therefore, is something which is sadly an awful part of our history, and it's the most awful thing imaginable. It's the most immense tragedy. You've had, it's okay, no, it's fine. Maybe someone can help you. No, they'll give it to someone there, and I also don't know how to do things on my phone. It's fine. There'll be a button somewhere you can press down. Give it to someone under 40 or 30, and they'll twiddle with it immediately. Okay, 14, even better. If you can find someone under 14, even better. Hostage taking is, we had some comments from people. My wife was dealing with some of the families at the beginning of the war because she's in media, and she was connecting them to media in Chutz La'aretz, and which was very painful for her. Some people were saying things like, I thought that my child had been taken hostage, but then I realized they'd been killed, and that's a relief. on some level. There was a father that said that. Then he found that his daughter had actually been taken a hostage, and Baruch Hashem, she was released. But this feeling is there a fate worse than death? It's a terrible thing to discuss. But the Gemara talks about this as well. In number 5, Yirmiyahu, when Yirmiyahu is talking to the people, Vayomru Hashem Elai says, "This is what God told me. Im Yamod Moshe u'Shmuel lefanai, even if Moshe and Shmuel were to get up in front of me right now, the end of the first temple, ein nafshi ala'am. There's nothing I can do for these people. They're finished. They're gone. There's nothing they can do to come back. Shlach me el panai, send them away from me. V'yetzu, let them go. Where are they going to go? They're going to be exiled. Where they're going to go? V'hayakim yomru elecha ana neitzi. When you say where are we going to go? This is our country. V'amart alem. You should say to them, Yirmiyahu, K'amar Hashem asher lemaves lemaves. Whoever's going to die, you're going to die. V'asher lecherev lecharev. Anyone who's going to be killed in battle is going to be killed. V'asher lerav lerav. Whoever's going to starve or die in the pestilence, they're going to die like that. V'asher l'shvi l'shevi. Whoever is going to be l'shvi l'shevi is going to be taken hostage. What is this list? Death and the sword and hunger and hostage taking. Look at the Gemara in number 6. Amalei Rava l'Rabba bar Meri. Minala milsa da Amar Rabbanan. Where did the rabbis get the idea? The pidyon shvuim mitzvah rabbahi. The pidyon shvuim, releasing hostages, redeeming hostages, is the greatest of mitzvot. Amalei, he says, this is where we get it from. Dichsiv, as it says, quotes the Pasuk, V'ki yomru elecha, asher neitzi v'amata aleim, ko hashma Hashem, asher lemavis lemavis, v'lecherev lecherev, asher lerav lerav, asher l'shvi l'shevi. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, kol ha'ma'ucha b'Pasuk zeh, kashem mechaveirav. As you go through this Pasuk, each one is worse than the last one. And the worst of all, shevi, kashem mikulam. The Shevi is the worst of all of them, Dekula Isnube, because it includes all of these terrible things. It includes death and pestilence and sickness and all. Therefore, there's no question that we regard the prospect of hostage taking as the worst of all tragedies that we could imagine, and we have an immense mitzvah to do what can be done in order to get the hostages back. Look at the Rambam, number 7. Pidyon shvuim kodem leparnas lefarnasas aniyim v'luchsoisam. Pidyon shvuim, redeeming hostages, comes even before the poor, before giving them clothes, before giving them money. Ve'ein lecha mitzvah gedola kepidyon shvuim. There is no mitzvah as great as pidyon shvuim. And he gives a whole list now of mitzvahs that you fulfill with pidyon shvuim. Because the people who are captive are starving. The hatzmeim, and they're thirsty. The harumim, and they lack basic facilities and clothing. The oimed besakanas nefashos, and we'll see this is very important. They are inherently in life-threatening danger as a hostage. And we'll see that there's a debate about this soon. And we'll see what kind of hostages are they talking about. One of the things that I'll just let out now is one of the questions we're going to have to ask next week is whether any of these sources are relevant to us today, which we'll go through. Or are they talking about a different reality? It's a major mistake to learn halachic sources and assume that the realities they're dealing with are the same. You need to know the mitziyut, you need to know the reality to know whether the sources are the same. So we'll see, is our hostage situation the same as the one that they're talking about? He says, the Rambam, carry on, if you ignore the hostages from redeeming them, hariza over, you are breaking all of the following mitzvahs. Don't let your heart be cruel and your hand be closed. Don't stand by while your friend is suffering. Don't let the non-Jews work the Jews that they've captured in front of your eyes and not do anything about it. You have to do them. You're breaking the mitzvah of opening your hand to save them. To save your brother, to make him live. And if that's not all enough, he throws in a pasuk from Mishlei. Save those who have been captured from death. And many similar things. He said it like 3 times. There's no greater mitzvah than the pidyon shvuim. Just in case you thought there was any possibility of anything otherwise. And if you look in the Gemara here, you'll see the Gemara number 8, again very relevant and resonant to our times. The Yerushalmi says, Rabbi Isi Itztad B'Sifsifa. Rabbi Isi, some of the Gira says is Rabbi Imi, was captured by bandits to a place where it was a very dangerous place. Amar Rabbi Yonasan. So Rabbi Yonasan heard about this. He said, Yichrach hamavis b'sadino. Let them make, shrouds for him. Tachrichin. Basically, Nebuch, he's dead already. What can I do? He was captured by those people. Forget about it. Nothing I can do. Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish. Reb Shimon ben Lakish turned around to him and says, no, you can't think that. You can't say that. Reb Shimon ben Lakish, also called Reish Lakish, is a very interesting character. In his early life, before he became a big Talmid Chacham, he was a strong man. Now, some people say he was a bandit. I heard Rav Yaakov Meidan say he was like a freedom fighter against the Romans, like a Jewish vigilante, JDL kind of guy. And he said, I'm not hearing that. You're going to give up on him? I'm going to kill or be killed. I'm going to go there and raid and get him back. I'm going to go back and take him by force. I'm not giving up on a hostage. Azel, he went, Ufaisen, and in the end he did a deal with the hostage takers. And they released him. Meaning one rabbi was prepared to give up, and the other rabbi said, no, you can't give up. We have to do what we can. We have to try and release them by force. Maybe that will mean the force itself will lead to a deal. Really interesting source. That by attacking them, that made it more likely that they would be able to do a deal because of the force. And again, who's going to make those kind of svaras? Who's going to make those cheshbonot in their mind? If we do this, if we kill the guy in Lebanon, it's more likely there'll be a deal, or it's less likely there'll be a deal. Who knows? I don't know. But you see from this source that Reish Lakish says, look, I feel that in this situation, force is needed in order to provoke a deal. You had a question? Yes, this is talking about hostages, not prisoners. In English, prisoner sounds like you're in prison for a good reason. You stole money, and we'll talk about that. I understand. You're right, 100%. Correct. I don't know whether there was a concept of prisoners of war before the 20th century. We now have a Geneva Convention, there are prisoners of war, and there are certain rules. I think up until the 20th century, prisoners and hostages in those days were pretty much the same thing. But still, there were prisoners who were in life danger, and there were prisoners who were not. And we'll talk about that. There's a shaila that came up, and we'll see Rav Olbach talks about it. If a Jewish man is put in prison for theft, is there a mitzvah of pidyon shvuim to get him out of an American jail? And Rav Shlomo Zalman says, what are you talking about? They're not just chapping people at random and holding them to ransom. He's in jail because he stole money. Maybe in jail he'll learn not to be a thief. Lefach, we should use public money to get him out of jail. So clearly, we're not talking about those people, but it is a good question. Rabbeinu Bachya says a fascinating thing in number 9, and then we'll get into some of the limitations on this. But just to finish on how important it is, Matzinu, says Rabbeinu Bachya, mitzvah shehi michlal hatzdaka. There is a mitzvah which is included, if you like, generally in tzedakah, u'gedoylehi min hatzdaka, but it's even greater than tzedakah. Vehi nikrad pidyon shvum. This is redeeming hostages. O mitzvah rabbi. The eshalom. I want to give you a chiddush. He says. I want to suggest ki legoydel ha mitzvah. Because of this mitzvah and how great it is, shavach hakodesh baruch hu et atzma. God introduced Himself and praised Himself with this mitzvah. B'dibur rishon shel anochi hu. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. In the 10 Commandments, what did God say? I am your God who took you out of Egypt. Okay, Sha'ama Asher Hosisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. V'loi ama Asher barasi shamayim va'aretz. Now, there's a lot you can say about this. The Kuzari has an entire hashkafic development that why is God introduced as God of history and not the God of creation. There's a lot of philosophical points to be made. But Rabbeinu Bachya is not making a philosophical point. Ki ratza lahaske ha-mitzvah. He wanted to mention the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim. V'hu mitzvahs Pidyon Shvuim shel shishim riboi. God says, I just rescued 600,000 shvuim. That's how I want to be known. That's how I want you to know me. And ends Rabbeinu Bachya, v'hu yitbarach tzivanu, and God elsewhere commands us, v'halachta b'drachav. Our value systems have to be a copy of the way we perceive God acts in the world. It's very famous. Gemara, Mahu Rachum, just we see God is merciful, and we see on people, Afatar Rachum, you copycat that behavior. So here, just as we see that God is the Poidesh Shvuim of all Poidesh Shvuim, he redeemed 600,000 people, so you have to be like that as well. By the way, just in brackets, Rav Soloveitchik used to say, okay, but maybe you can do miracles as well, but I understand, but that's for 600,000. We don't have to get 600,000 now. We have to get a few hundred out, but Be'ezrat Hashem. Rav Soloveitchik mentions this mitzvah of halachta b'drachav. It's nothing to do with this, but I can't resist it. He says, God always introduces God as unique. There is none other like God. There is nothing in the universe that even compares to God. And therefore, just as God is unique, you have a mitzvah of halachta b'drachav, you have to be unique. Okay, because that is the mitzvah of going in the ways of God. V'halachta b'drachav. Okay, this is all very well. There is a massive mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim, the greatest of all mitzvahs, but there are limitations. Let's have a look. Number 10 says the Mishnah: Ein podim es hashvuim yoseh akidei demehem. You're not allowed to redeem captives for more than their worth. That's a very cryptic phrase. How much are people worth? We'll see some interesting tshuvas on that coming up. Mipnei tikon ha'olam. Meaning, what's tikon ha'olam? Meaning there's a longer term picture that you have to be aware of. Yes, on the one hand, you have a captive and their price is like without value, without limit. They're human life. And you have a massive mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim. But there's a longer term concern of tikon ha'olam. There's going to be consequences which are unwanted in the intermediate or longer terms. The Gemara will debate what those consequences are. That's Tikkun HaOlam. The Ein Mavrichim Es HaShvuim, we're less focused on this right now, but we will come back to it. You can't break out by force captives, Mipnei Tikkun HaOlam, because that will also be bad in the long term. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Omer Mipnei Takanos HaShvuim. It's not just bad in the long term, it'll be bad for whoever's left. If you break out 3 of the 5 guys, they're going to crack down on the other 2, and it's going to be worse for them. So you see here the Mishnah introduces limits. You can't just go in and redeem captives because of your sense of enormous rachamim for the captives and the mitzvah of it. So the Gemara asks, what is this tikkun ha'olam? We're really dealing with the first one of the issue of paying more than the value. Number 11. Iboilahu, they asked, Hai mipnei tikkun ha'olam, this tikkun ha'olam, this longer term agenda that we're worried about. Mishum duchka de tzibura, is it because we're worried about the pressure on the community? Meaning what? If you keep having to raise money for another Pidyon Shvuim and another Pidyon Shvuim, and people have to give more money and more money and more money, you're going to impoverish the community. You can't do that. You have to think of the klal as well as this poor soul who's, let me just go on a little because I don't have a lot of time. You have to think of that. Or Dilma, or maybe Mishum Deloy Lagarvu Velesitzfe. Or maybe the problem is not the community. The problem is that if we pay for a hostage too much money, that will encourage more hostage taking. Okay? Maybe that's the concern. Rashi, number 12, says the nafkamina is if they've got a rich relative that wants to redeem them, then it's not on the public funds, so then we're not concerned about financial pressure on the public, but we are still concerned about the long-term consequences. Okay? So the Rambam actually, and pretty much all the Meforshim, pick the first, not the second reason. Sorry, the second, not the first reason. Excuse me, still a bit jet lagged. The concern of Pidyon Shvuim is the concern that they will come to take more captives. Look in number 13. Says the Rambam, Ein podim es hashvuim b'yoseh al demehem. Again, we will come back to what that means more than their value. We do not redeem captives for more than their value. Mipnei tikkun ha'olam. What is the tikkun ha'olam? Shelo yiyu ha'oivim roidfim achreihem l'shvusim. So we don't encourage more hostage taking. The ein mavrichin, and he goes, we don't break out shvuim because it'll be bad on the other ones. So the reason seems to be that we do not want to encourage future hostage taking. Go over the page to page 4. So the Shulchan Aruch rules this way. Says number 14. Kol rega. Any minute, any moment that we delay in trying to get the hostages out, whatever we can, bring it forward. If we delay it, it's as if we've murdered them. Very, 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 very severe. We cannot delay it. However, then he paskins, but we can't pay too much. Like we saw in the Rambam, that people shouldn't be encouraged future hostage taking. But a person can pay whatever they like to redeem themselves. If it's just about you and your own money, that's okay. So too, if a Talmid Chacham has been captured, or or even a young, promising, potential Talmid Chacham, and they could turn into a great person, then we pay a fortune to get them back. We'll see what that means. We're coming up right now. So, what are the rules? The Shulchan Aruch says, Do whatever you can to get the hostages out. Don't pay too much. Doesn't define what that is, because that would encourage future hostage taking. And the two exceptions seem to be, you can get yourself out of jail. If you've got the money, that's fine, because that's kind of a personal issue. And if there's a Talmid Chacham, then we can do whatever we need to get them out of captivity. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about Rav Hutner. And when Rav Hutner was captured in 1970 by Palestinian terrorists, and we'll see what happened there. But first, let's see a Gemara that seems to be a contradiction to that. Look at number 15. We just said you're not allowed to pay too much. You're not allowed to pay too much. Tan Rabbana says number 15. This is one of the Gemaras that we read, often people read on Tisha B'Av. It's one of the Gemaras that deals with the Churban. Maaseh Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, who is the famous Rabbi Yeshua, student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Shehalach lekrach gadol shebaromi. He went, this was post-Churban. This was, I'd say, around the year 100 CE. Okay? So it's into the period, after the period of destruction. He went to Rome. Amrullah, they said to him, Tinok echad yesh bebeit asurim. There's a Jewish child who's in jail here. And what was the nature of this child? Yafa einayim, toiv roi, and he was a very attractive little boy, young man, which means he was also in danger of being abused, sexually abused in prison, which was another factor as to why he wanted to get this child or this young man out. Halach va'amad al Pesach beis asurin. So Rabbi Yeshua went to the prison, and he kind of surreptitiously, without getting the guards to realize what he was doing, quoted the beginning of a posuk. That's what you do if you're trying to work out who's inside. Do they know the end of the posuk, or do they not know the end of the posuk? He wants to see who is this kid. So Amma, he says, Mi natan l'meshisa Yaakov. Who was given Yaakov up to spoil? The Yisrael aboises him, and Yisrael over to robbers. That's the beginning of a posuk in Yeshaya. The Anna Oisa Tinok, and the young man comes back with the end of the posuk. Halo Hashem zu chatanu. We were sinned against Hashem. Chatanu loy. And they didn't walk in his ways. They didn't walk in his ways. They didn't listen to his Torah. He says, this is a young Talmid Chacham in the making. He knows Tanakh Baal Peh. Ama muftachani bo shemoyre hoy Rabbi Yisrael. I am confident this kid is going to be a major figure for the Jewish people. Ha'avoida, and he takes an oath. She'eini zaz mikan ad she'abdenu. I am not going to leave here until I get him out. B'chol mammon she'poiskim alav. Whatever they ask, I'm going to pay whatever they ask. Amru, and what happened? They said, Loi zaz misham ad shepadu b'mammon harbe. And Hitaka paid a fortune to get this kid out. V'loi hayimamim riyamim u'utim, and it wasn't very long, ad shehora harabi Yisrael, until he became a great posek. Umano, who did this kid become? Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. He was the famous Rabbi Yishmael, the kind of partner and sparring partner of Rabbi Akiva in HALACHA. So what's going on here? This is an important story where somebody saw a kid in prison, paid a fortune to get him out. What happened to the rule that you're not allowed to pay too much money?
What about that it wasn't a maid?
That he wasn't a what?
A maid.
A maid, meaning it wasn't a woman? Okay, but he wasn't a maid. He was a kid. He was a Jewish kid that had been captured. Tosfos gives 3 reasons why this is an exception, and they become very important to us. Have a look in number 16. Tosfos comes along and says, Kol mammon she'poiskim alav. He paid a fortune to get this captive back. Why? And he says an interesting, an unusual thing. Ki ika sakanos nefashos. When there is a danger to the hostage's life, then you pay whatever it takes. If they're in life-threatening danger. So that's why they paid more. Well, that's a bit of a problem. Why is it a problem? Because every hostage is in life-threatening danger. That's the whole nature of being a hostage. Isn't that what the Rambam said? The nature of being a hostage is that you're in danger of immediate death. So what does he mean? This boy was in more danger? We'll talk about that. Onami, or inami, alternatively, mishum de muflug b'chachmahi. Haya. Okay, that's the Talmid Chacham exception. You could see this kid was going to be the most fantastic Talmid Chacham. Talmidei Chachamim, you can't live without them. They're worth a fortune of money. Interesting, they described him physically as well, but the Tosfos doesn't mention that because we didn't differentiate in this between. It seems to be because it was mentioned in the Gemara. In number 17, Tosfos gives a 3rd reason. What are the first 2 again? Either that he was in life-threatening danger, so it was different, or it was for a Talmid Chacham. Says the Tosfos at the end, at the end, Inami of the end of number 17, B'shas churban habayis loy shayach de loy ligravu. Because it was such a time of churban, the consideration maybe they'll take more hostages in future was not relevant. Why not? What was the nature of Churban? So let's just dwell on that for a second. Why might that be an exception? When there's a time of Churban, you can pay anything you need to pay. So there's a few reasons that I've seen given. One reason is because it's a time of Churban, how worse can it get? It's the whole thing is a disaster. Think about it in the middle of the Holocaust. Like whatever you do, it's not going to make it worse. It can't get any worse. It's as bad as it can be. That could be one answer. Therefore, the whole long-term implications argument is just not relevant right now. Rav Osher Weiss gives another suggested reason, which I think is his chiddush when he talks about this. He says, because maybe in a time of Churban, the people need more chizuk. There needs to be a morale boost. You can't have these people stuck in prison when everybody is worried about them, etc. Because it's such a disastrous time for the Jewish people, you need to go that extra mile to raise the morale of the people. Interesting. That may be because it's a churban. But what about this life-threatening situation? Most poskim reject this and say it's just not relevant. And we'll see in a minute a very interesting tshuva, because every hostage is in a life-threatening situation. And let me get you to the case of Rav Hutner. I put at the bottom of page 4. In 1970, you probably remember this. Again, I was only a little nipper at the time. The Rav Hutner was hijacked. His plane was hijacked and rerouted to Jordan. Rav Hutner was on the plane, his wife, his daughter-in-law, his daughter and his son-in-law, Rabbi David, was on the plane, and the terrorists let all the non-Jews go, and they said basically they're going to kill all the Jews. And the question is what to do about it. So go over to page 5, you'll see there was an interesting debate at the time. Rav Hutner was taken away, they realized who he was, and held in a private, isolated location, and everybody was davening to get him out. Eventually, he was reunited with the other hostages, and eventually they were released. At the time, by the way, Jordan used this because the plane landed in Jordan. Jordan was incensed, and King Hussein took that opportunity to kill as many of the Palestinians as he could in Jordan, Black September, and that's when Yasser Arafat ended up going to Lebanon, which of course was the cause for the later Lebanon War, etc. as well. At the time, the poskim debated, what should we do? Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky was asked about this. They said, look, Rav Hutner, he surely is the Talmid Chacham exception. He's one of the Gedolei Hador. We have to pay whatever it takes to get out Rav Hutner. And Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said no. Rav Moshe Feinstein, I gave you the letter, I gave you the original and a translation, said, yeah, we have to do a deal. We have to do a deal? Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky says, no, we're not doing no deals. He was against it for a few reasons. First of all, he said, the Jewish people is a war. This is a very important factor which we'll come back to next time and the time after. This is not talking about a private hostage-taking situation, which for most of Jewish history was for the purpose of money. They wanted money. The more people they took, the more money they got. They were only interested in the money, which is, by the way, why you can see that in certain hostage situations, there was not such a danger to life, because the Dafka needed to keep them alive to get the money. Said Rav Yaakov, he says, no, this is not our situation now. These people are taking hostages because they're at war with the state of Israel. It's a completely different situation, and the normal rules don't apply. We'll see that in more detail. He also felt that it was it would be a big chilul Hashem to get Rav Hutner out and to not get anyone else out. And he was worried about that. So he told them under no circumstances. Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote to Golda Meir, and in the end, again, there was a happy resolution to that. And you probably remember the whole story and when Rav Hutner came home, etc., etc. How did he get out? They released him. They released him. I don't know all the details of why they released him. They ran. Did they do that then? I don't think they did that then. That was Entebbe. We'll get to Entebbe next week. In the case of Rav Hutner, they actually released the hostages. We'll end the shir in 15 minutes with a thought that Rav Hutner had while he was a hostage. But you see that the idea of redemption of hostages when their lives are in danger is a complicated one. I brought you some sources. I'm not going to in great detail, but just look at 19 for a second. It's okay. Don't worry about it. They booby trap the phone so you can't turn them off. So, okay. First of all, the Ramban. Let's look at number 19. Let's go through some of these sources quickly. We're not going to read every word. The Ramban says, okay, Tosfos mentions this if the life is in danger. Said it can't be. Because every hostage life is in danger. That's what he says there. He says the Talmid Chacham situation is different. Why? Because we can't live without a Talmid Chacham. If it's the Gadol Hador, it's the Gadol Hador. It's worth all that money. But a normal life-threatening situation, well, that's everybody. And so too the Maharam Lublin. I want to look in a little bit more detail the Maharam Lublin because it's a fascinating shuva which has its ironic side as well. Look at number 20 with me. Says the Maharam Lublin. Who's the Maharam Lublin? The Maharam Lublin was Rav Meir Wolf ben Gedalia of Lublin. He lived in Poland in the 16th century. Al Dvar Hanar, there was a case in his time of a young boy, Hanitpas b'yedei ha'Yishmaelim, who was captured by the Arabs. Shetanu alav shenitpas imazayna Yishmaeles, and they claimed that he'd had sexual relations with an Arab woman, which was prohibited. Okay? Jewish boy. V'roitzim l'dayna b'misa, and they wanted to kill him. Or ba'onis heimedat chas v'shalom, or to convert him to Islam, which makes it okay in some way. Okay? Imakal yishmereu tzura v'yichiyeu. Does the kal have an obligation? Chayavim livdoisa b'mitzvahs pidyon shvuim. Do they have an obligation to get this kid out? Now, again, this kid got himself into the trouble. He ended up running off with an Arab girl, and now the Arabs caught him. So what does he say here? And is it even, sorry, I missed a line. He was guilty. He got himself into the trouble. He couldn't resist the girl. He knew the consequences. He slept with the girl anyway. If we do have to get him out, do we have to pay extra to get him out? Can we overpay to get him out? What does it mean, what he's worth? So look at the tshuva of the Maharam Lublin. Says the Maharam Lublin, I think it's absolutely clear, he says. Of course we have to try and get this kid out. It doesn't matter the kid made a stupid mistake. He doesn't deserve to be killed for it. We all make mistakes. He got himself into trouble. Of course we have to redeem him. Omnam. Look under the line that says tshuva. Nearly poshut, it's equally clear. But we mustn't overpay for the kid. I don't know why you would even think that you have to overpay for this guy. There's no difference. There's no difference that he's in life-threatening danger. He rejects that idea. He's not a Talmid Chacham. He's a silly kid who ran off with an Arab girl. And he brings a proof from a famous case before of the Mari vial, which is not comical, but you'll see why it's interesting. On the second paragraph, Mitshuvas Rabbeinu Yaakov vial. He brings a case from the Mari vial who lived in Europe beforehand. B'masa shel ishtoi v'nino shel Moreno Arav Avram Ezra. There's this fellow called Avram Ezra, and his wife and his granddaughter, I think it turns out, was kidnapped and held hostage. Shahu nitpasim lemavet biyad shilton, and the sultan or the head of the town held them for ransom. Shilton echad, one strong ruler held them. And he also wanted to convert the girl to Islam. And what happened? The husband couldn't afford to redeem his wife. Rav David, this guy Rav David Senna, came in as a sort of philanthropist and paid out the money to redeem this fellow's wife and granddaughter. But at elef sahuvim, and he paid 1,000 gold coins. And what happened next? Vatan alav Avram Ezra. And this Avram Ezra was then asked to pay the money back. The David Senna said, I've redeemed your wife and your granddaughter. I paid 1,000 gold coins for them. We can work out a payment plan, but you need to give me the money back. And the husband took him to court because he said, you paid too much money for my wife. He had two tainas. He says, number one, you pay too much. And number two, why so quick? We could have done a better deal with the government. She was okay, So he took him to Beis Din, saying, I don't owe you the money because you overpaid for my wife. You can't make this stuff up, okay? He didn't want to pay. He claimed, you paid over the odds for my wife. And what's interesting, he says, in the end, the Mari Wild threw him out of court and said, how disgusting. Of course you have to pay for your wife. But one of the things he didn't say, and this is when, tshuvas are brilliant, when it's not that they analyze what was said, but what wasn't said. At no point did he turn around to the guy and say, well, you're allowed to overpay if the person's in danger. He never said that. Meaning you're not allowed to overpay, even if the person's in danger. Here, of course, you have to pay back because it's your wife, whatever. But he never said that. And therefore, he said, you see from here that this idea that if the person's in danger, he said, is rejected. And I brought you 21. I'm not getting into this in detail. There's the Piskei Tshuva brings down different people one side and the other side, whether this danger to life issue is relevant. Bottom line, most poskim hold that the issue of danger to life is not a decisive factor when it comes to paying over the odds, because sof all hostages to some degree or other are in mortal danger. You can look at the back and forth on that later on. I brought you the issue of the Maram of Rottenburg. The Maram of Rottenburg is a very famous case. He was the leader of the German Jewry in the late 1200s, and he was taken captive, I think by King Rudolf, and he was held for ransom in a castle in Ensisheim, which is a little village now on the German-French border in Alsace. And the king requested an enormous ransom to get the Maram of Rottenburg back. So you'll say, well, of course it's mutter, because he's a Talmid Chacham. How can you get more of a Talmid Chacham case than this? And they raised an enormous ransom to get him back. And he refused. He did not let them pay the ransom, and he died. He died of old age. He didn't die of mistreatment. I imagine it didn't do him any good to be in the castle, but he died eventually, and they wouldn't even release his body. And the famous situation is Alexander Wimpton later paid money to get his body back. And the story goes that the Maharam appeared to him in a dream and said, you can have two rewards. Either you can have riches for you and your family for all the generations, or you can be with me in Olam Haba. So he took Olam Haba, because you never know whether money's good for your kids or not good for your kids. Okay, it could go either way. But Olam Haba sounds like a good deal. And in the end, they're buried together. If you go to the cemetery in Worms, you were there, you see the Maram of Rottenburg, and Wimpton is buried there. So the question is, why didn't he allow them to pay the ransom? So just go over the page. I know we're flipping around. Just go over the page. I brought you the Yam Shel Shlomo. The Yam Shel Shlomo says a very interesting thing. He says the reason he didn't let them pay over the odds is because he realized that they didn't know exactly who he was. And if they paid so much money, they would become aware, wow, what do we got here? You take one of their gedolim, and it's megabucks. So he realized they wanted to kidnap other senior poskim. The Rosh, who was the student of the Ram of Rottenburg, escaped. He actually made it to Spain and became the Rav of Toledo, which was interesting. You had an Ashkenazi Rav who became the Rav of Toledo, which is a whole different story. But the Ram says, the Yam Shel Shlomo says he wouldn't let them pay because he didn't want to encourage. They were just going to take more Gedolim, and it was going to be worse in the long term for the Torah of the Jewish people. And therefore he says that was the answer of the Maram of Rottenburg case. However, he brings in 23 and also the Radbaz in 24 and says at the end of the day, however, let's look at the Maral in 23. V'ha'idna, he was in Poland in the 1600s. Anshe goimle chasadim. People are very generous. Even though there's a halacha that you're not meant to overpay, you can't hold Jews back. Because when there's a hostage situation, their hearts are impossible to... You can't tell people that we can't redeem these hostages. It's very interesting. So people redeem even for over the odds. There was a situation in Turkey. And people were paying more and more and more and more money for hostages. They didn't care how much money it was. God should give them schar. And their place is surely in Olam Haba. They had all the right intentions. And he said, at the end of the day, we're not a big people. We can't afford to lose anybody. If they've got hostages, these are all precious Jews. We're a small community, and every Jew counts. And therefore, we have to get as many people back as we can get. And therefore, even though there is this general principle we don't overpay, Jews have not stuck to that over the years. The Rabbi in number 24, I'll summarize what he says. He says, how much is called the worth of a person? So he says, the worth of a person is what non-Jews would pay to get their hostages back. What would non-Jews give to get their own hostages back? He says, and even though it's not the same, and he brings it because the non-Jewish hostages are big, starker people, and the Jews are nebach, like, shlemils, like very little, and you would have thought that this was worth much more than this one. It doesn't matter. The going rate is whatever non-Jews would pay. However, he says, nobody sticks to that, because the Jews have incredible urge to redeem hostages. And look at the last paragraph. The afal pi of number 24. Sheyesh lebal din loyma kol hatzanaim halalu. And even though there's a rule that we don't redeem captures for more than they're worth, maybe there were exceptions in this situation. And since you never know, let the Jewish people be. Let them have this enormous midah of rachamim. They get so happy when the hostages are released. And surely they will get a great reward for wanting to get these hostages back. So what do we see so far? What's the story so far? Let's summarize and end with one thing. There's an enormous mitzvah to redeem hostages. However, there's a tikkun olam imperative not to overpay for the hostages. What does overpay mean? Overpay means more than other people would pay for their hostages. And what's the reason for that? Because we don't want to encourage hostage taking. There are exceptions. One exception is a Talmud Chacham, although we saw with the Maram of Rottenburg and with Rav Hutner, it doesn't always work that way. One exception might be, how much worse could it get? And one exception might be when the hostage is in life-threatening danger, although most poskim rejected that because they said, look, at the end of the day, all hostages are in life-threatening danger. That's not relevant. However, notwithstanding that restriction, that ceiling, we see that Jewish community after Jewish community could not hold themselves back from campaigning to redeem their hostages. And what I find this so interesting and inspiring that we see this today. We see the people on the one hand, on the other hand, how can we yes, how can we no, etc. What we have not discussed yet, which we'll discuss next week, is how does any of this work when the price the terrorists are demanding is not money, but is the release of other terrorists? How do you weigh that up? Now, if you start saying, well, what would non-Jewish governments, how many terrorists would they release to get people back? None is the answer. In fact, there are even situations where non-Jewish governments will even send their own soldiers in to kill the hostage of their hostage because they reckon a dead soldier is much less damage than a hostage soldier, which we couldn't even think of doing that like on purpose. Nebuch, it's like in the heat of war, things happen that we don't want to happen. But how can you compare the Jewish government who give away 1,000 hostages? 1,000 terrorists, for a hostage, etc. So we need to talk about that next week, because there is what to say about that, and it doesn't necessarily go with these sources. But I wanted to finish just with one thought, which is it's 1 minute to go till 11:15. Just look at the last page. Rav Hutner was asked by his son-in-law, Rabbi David, what was he thinking when he was all alone, taken aside as a hostage, separate from all the other people who were kidnapped on the plane? And Rav Hutner answered, he was thinking of a Rashi in Yevomus Daf Ayin Dalet. That's what he was thinking. What was the Rashi he was thinking of? So look at the Gemara, number 25. Tan Rabbanon. Ger shebalis gar bizman hazeh. If a non-Jew wants to come and convert to Judaism, Omrilo, we say to them, why on earth would you want to join the Jewish people? Don't you know how nebach the situation of the Jewish people is today? The chufim, how under pressure we are? Sechufim, muturafim, in Golis, persecuted, anti-Semitism. The Yisurim ba'am aleim, what troubles we have as Jews? You want to be Jewish? Is there anything wrong with you? Why would you want to be Jewish? Ve'im omer, if the non-Jew says, Yodea ani, I do know, ve'eini kadai, and I'm not even worth that, makabel masomiyad, then we say, oh, you're the real deal. What does he mean, I'm not worth that? Rashi says in number 26, eini kadai, eini roi lehishtatev b'tzarasan. I'm not even worthy of being persecuted as a Jew. It's a schut to be a Jew, even if you're persecuted as a Jew. Umi yeten ve'ezke lekach. Halavai that I had the schut to be persecuted because I'm Jewish. For me, it would be an honor to be persecuted as a Jew. Says Rav Hutner, that's what I was thinking of this Rashi when I was sitting there all on my own, like, Baruch Hashem, I have the schut to be Jewish. Even in this situation, it's a merit. Okay, Rav Hutner could think those things, and now you know what Rav Hutner was thinking on the plane. But this, we are only just at the beginning of this journey. Next week we need to take it into the terrorists for hostage situation, which invoke a whole bunch of different sources. Quick question, yes, Simon.
Is your share regularly now Monday?
Yes. Oh, that was an easy question. Is my share always going to be on Monday? Yeah. I've never had a yes/no answer so easy as that. Yes. Yeah, yes. And I've got to finish because we're over time.
To the sources of all the speakers falling in a military battle,
Yes.
being taken Chevy versus
Civilians, yes, absolutely. And that is a major consideration, 100%. We will see next week that is a major consideration as to whether soldiers need to know. Rabbi Vadi Yosef talks about this and others too, that no matter what happens, we will not leave you behind. Will that motivate them to fight more? Which is not the case with a civilian. Which is interesting because Rav Gorin says a soldier has to know that whatever happens, they're going to come and get him. I wonder whether that's what soldiers think today. If you ask the soldier, would you want us to release 1,000 Palestinian terrorists if, God forbid, you ever got captured? I think a lot of our young people would say, no, you don't do that for me, which is interesting. But we're going to talk about who knows how to weigh those issues, but we will talk about them next week. Okay, we'll leave it here. Thank you so much.